Hey folks, it's Kyle from Gravity here, back again to melt your brain with more JavaScript. So in the last video, I gave you a bit of an overview on how a modern JavaScript web application is structured. Today, we're going to go over how to build a REST API. So we're going to keep this super simple. To start off, you're going to need a couple of things. So you're going to need Node.js, and you're going to want to install Express.js. Set up a basic database. Doesn't matter which database client you're using, just use whatever your favorite is, whether that's SQL or Mongo. And I'm also going to be using this piece of software called Postman. So this is a free application you can download for Mac or Windows that will let you test out API calls. And this is very handy because it means you don't have to build a client or write any code in order to test the endpoints that we're going to build. You can actually send data to your API here and then test the response. So if you haven't got Postman, there's other tools similar to this, but I recommend Postman. If you haven't got it already, go ahead and download it and install it. Once you've done that, you want to set up a very basic Node server. So you can see my server here. Like all I'm doing is import and express, import my API file, which is here, which is where we're going to be doing the work today. And then a couple more lines of code here. So I'm saying use express JSON. So this is basically some Express middleware that means all of the data sent to our API will be able to access as JSON statement. And I'm then saying use my API file, which I'm importing here, and then start this server. So this is like really straightforward. So I'm just going to go ahead and start my server. Great. So I can just leave that running in the background. Next, I'm going to jump to my API file. So what we're going to do today is set up 4 endpoints. So I've already created my database here. So basically we're going to build, if you're familiar with the term CRUD, we're going to develop a basic CRUD API. So we're going to create a book. We're going to get the book. We're going to update or patch the book, and we're going to delete the book. Now, when you're building a REST API, there's a lot of different methods that you can use. So if I go over here, you can see, you may have heard of post, get, put, patch, delete. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of methods here. You're probably never going to use most of these. The ones that you're most commonly going to use is get, which we use to get something from the API, post to create something, put to create or update, patch to update, and then delete to delete something. So we're just going to look at get, post, patch, and delete today. What we're going to do first is create our post endpoint. Inside my API file here, I'm just importing Express, creating an API, which I then export. I've included UUID here, which is a free Node package, which we'll use for creating IDs for our created items. And then I'm just importing my database here. This is going to be very simple. We're not going to cover authentication or errors or using models or controllers in this. I just want to keep it very simple. This will work, but it's not what you would use in a real world scenario, but it's great for learning. And then in future videos, we'll build upon this to look at things like error handling and like API authentication. What I'm going to do then is create my first endpoint. So we want to do API.post, and then we pass a string, which is going to be our URL endpoint. So API book. So we want to create a book, and then we're going to have an async function. Okay, so typically what I'm doing here is I'm just gonna handle this API call with this callback function directly here. In a real world application, you wouldn't do this. So what you would do is, you would have a controller function here, but I don't want to overcomplicate this by having multiple different files and talking about models and controllers. So let's just keep it very simple. So the first thing we're doing here is defining our endpoint. So this is API/book, and then we've got a callback function. And this has two parameters. So there's rec, which is short for request, and response. So whenever we create our API call, we get past this request object, which will contain the data that we've passed. And then we have our response, which we'll use to send the response back to the client. And these are automatically generated and handled by Express.js. We don't need to worry too much about how these work. All we're going to be looking at today is getting the data from the request body and then sending a response to the client. What I want to do here is I'm just going to do a console log. So just to show you how this is going to work. So let me just get let's make this a bit smaller, put console down here. So what we're going to do is we're going to post some JSON to our endpoint, so API book, and I'm just pointing this to localhost API book. So what we want to do is just say, right, our book is going to be called lifestyle startup. Our book will have an author, that's me. So, and then we'll give it a published date. Let's say 2017/05/12. When I hit send, this post request will be picked up by this endpoint, and all it's going to do at this point is log out the request body, which is this. So make sure that's saved. Post. Okay, now you can see I've posted that, and you can see, whoops, the data has been logged out here. This request is hanging because we haven't actually sent the response yet, so I'm just going to cancel that. So what we want to do here is we've got our data. For this example, all we're going to do is insert this data into my database table. So you can see here, I've already got a table set up called book. I've got my ID, title, author, published date created, and date updated. So these two columns are automatically populated whenever an item is created or updated. Let me go ahead and insert that into the database. So insert. Actually, what I want to do first is add an ID. So direct body ID equals UUID. This will use this package to create a unique ID, and then we'll insert it into the database. So wait. The other thing we want to do here then is send a response to the client. So we're going to use our res object, and we're going to set the status. So when you're dealing with APIs, there's a lot of different statuses that you can have. So you may be familiar with some of these. So for example, we've got status 200, which is okay. 404, which I'm sure everyone has encountered, which means not found. 401, unauthorized. 500, internal server error. So this is a whole topic in itself, but today we're just going to assume that everything works okay, and we're only going to be dealing with 200 status. So in a future lesson, we'll talk about error handling and how we catch some of these other errors. But for this example, I'm just going to say status was 200, so the request was fine, and then we'll send a message to the client saying book added, and then we'll just send the data back. When I hit send, this should insert the book into the database and then send the response to the client. So nope, we've got an error. So what is our error? Unknown column, published date. Okay, so it's published date. Okay, so you can see now that it's created a unique ID. It's inserted this row with title, author, published date, date created, and date updated. And then we've got our response message that's came back here. So the response was 200, okay. We've got our custom message, book added, and then we've got our book data passed back here. Hopefully that is pretty straightforward. The next thing we're going to do then is create a get endpoint so we can actually get that data back. So this time I'm going to do api.get API book, and we're going to add an ID parameter here. So basically this means that we can pass the ID of the book that we want in the URL. And whenever you precursor this with a colon, that just means this is going to be a dynamic parameter. So we'll do the same thing again. We'll have a asynchronous callback function, and this time we're going to do const data equals await db book dot select. We'll just select everything for this, where ID. What I'm going to do here then is, so this is going to go to the database. It's going to select everything where the ID is this, which we'll just pass here. And then we'll do the same thing again. We'll just assume that this worked. Res.state is send, and then we'll do book data. So this time in Postman, rather than making a post request, we're going to change this to get, same address, API, book, and then this time we're going to pass in our unique ID, and this should then get the book from the database and return it to the client. So I hit send, boom. So we've got our book, and then we passed it back to the client. Super easy. Next thing we want to do is update our book. So let's say that we got the wrong publish date. So what we can do then is, for this, we're going to use patch. Patch and put can be quite confusing. Patch basically just means if we want to just update one of these fields. Put can be if we want to update it if it exists, but if it doesn't exist, we create it. But to keep this simple, we'll just focus on patch. So we're going to use the same endpoint. So API book ID. Now you'll notice that I'm using the exact same endpoint here as here, but that's okay because we're using different methods here, so we can use the same URLs as long as we use different HTTP methods. And same thing again. And then this time we want to do db book update publish date. Let's just say, actually what we want to do here is send through a new publish date. So this is going to be publish date where ID is rec params ID. So same thing again, we're going to extract this dynamic ID and we're going to update our book table where the publish date is the publish date that we're going to post, and then where the ID is equal to this ID. Let's just make this. So you can see here our publish date was 2017. Whenever I send this, it should update our database, and of course we want to send the status that this succeeded, and we'll do book updated, and we'll just pass this back as an example. Okay, so send. Oh, got an error. What happened there? We're not passing in. Okay, so we want to send. So book updated. Check the database, and yes, that updated. Finally, then the next thing we're going to look at is how to delete our book, and this can be pretty similar to what we've just covered. So this time, you probably guessed it, we're going to use api.delete. Going to use the same URL, so it's going to be API book ID and this time we want to do so book database delete where ID is, and then we'll do res status 200 send book deleted ID. I'm gonna go and copy my ID here, and then with Postman you can create all these different endpoints, and you'd actually save them into collections so that you can access these easily, which is great whenever you're testing stuff because you don't have to keep typing in these URLs. So I'm gonna go to book ID, this time delete. We don't need to pass anything in the body, so send. Okay, book deleted. Go to the database and our book is gone. Let's just recap over that once again. So we've created 4 endpoints to create, get, update, and delete a book. And the structure of these is all pretty similar. You know, we've imported Express.js, we've created a router, which we've called API, and then we've created these different endpoints. So we're saying API post, then we pass in the endpoint that we want to use. This can be anything that we want. And then we have a callback function here, which takes the request, which is basically what we're posting. Whenever we post this information, whenever we log out request, you'll see a whole lot of information, but what you're actually concerned with in most cases is the request body, sometimes the headers. So the request body is going to contain this information, and then we're going to insert this into your database, and then we're sending a response. So we're saying that the response status was 200, which means okay, and then we're sending some data back to the client, which we then see here. Now, as I said at the start, this is a very simple example. You wouldn't do this in a real world scenario. Typically what we'd be doing is we'd have a controller method which would get called here and then pass these, because this isn't, and then we would have a model, because this isn't really this isn't very reusable. So for example here, you know, we're getting the book. If we needed to get a book in other places, this doesn't really make sense to have this information here. But in the next lesson, what I'm going to do is go over MVC or model view controller, and we'll look in a wee bit more detail about how we expand this out to make it more production ready. But for the purposes of explaining how a REST API works, you know, this is a very simple, straightforward example. And in many cases, all you will be doing is, you know, well, you'd have your controller and models, but you'll just be building this out with different endpoints for different objects. So for example, if we were building an API for Amazon, you know, we might have an API to get books. We might have one to get DVDs or different kind of products. And the whole point of doing this is, you know, you might think, well, I don't need to build an API. I could just do my data manipulation directly in the code, but it's not good practice, because, you know, the whole point of building the API is so that different clients can interact with your data and your backend. So yes, if you're building a web app and you just hard code all these database queries into your code, it'll work. But if you decide later on that you want to add a mobile app, it becomes very difficult. Whereas if you've got an API, it's like you can use the same API to access your application from different clients. You can create a public API where other people can access it as well. So I hope that was useful today. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe and hit the little notification bell so you get notified whenever I create a new video. In the next lesson, what we'll do is look at model view controller and how we expand upon this to build it into something that's a bit more suitable for the real world. Until next time, thank you very much.